Dean Chris Brown or Christopher. Christopher, I don't like to use Christopher because it feels like my mother used to reprimand me by saying Christopher. And so, yeah, I'm not, but Dean Chris Brown. And so, I want to welcome everybody. This is a very important project. As someone who studies race and philosophy and communication, a project like this is up my alley, way up my alley in terms of the kind of project that humanizes the experiences of African Americans by showing some of the strategies and tactics that have dehumanized or depersonalized them. And so I think this is a very important project, and I'm so happy that you all are here to join us to hear from our wonderful speaker and hear about the great work that he has done on this project. So I want to welcome the students and faculty and members of the community, and I want to thank you all for being here today, and I hope you enjoyed this wonderful presentation. Thank you all. So without further ado, I will bring back Dr. Jill Cooley.
Thank you so much, Dean Brown, for that lovely welcome. Hello, my name is Jill Cooley, and I am Associate Professor of History here at Minnesota State Mankato. And I'd like to start by thanking my colleagues in the History Department for their support of this event, as well as our partners and co-sponsors, the Department of Government, the Department of Gender and Women's Studies, the Kessel Peace Institute, and African American Affairs. And a special thank you to Malik Baxter Hunter and Elise Anderson for their help in making this event happen. I appreciate it very much. And thanks to all of you for joining us. We have people here joining us in person in Ostrander here on campus. And thank you for those of you who are joining us on Zoom as well. And just by the way, if you're joining us on Zoom, feel free to enter your questions that you have in the question and answer section of the webinar. And of course, we'll get to those as we take questions here in the auditorium as well. Now, before I introduce our speaker for this afternoon, let us recognize that we live, work, and learn in the homeland of the Dakota people whose language frames our name, Minnesota State University, Mankato. So I'm thrilled to welcome Chad Montrie to campus to discuss his new book, Whiteness in Plain View, A History of Racial Exclusion in Minnesota. Dr. Montrie is a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell, where he teaches courses on American social history and historical methodology. He is a 2022-2023 Fulbright Research Scholar and the author of 4 additional books, including The Myth of Silent Spring, Rethinking the Origins of American Environmentalism. His article in that very northern city, Recovering a Forgotten Struggle for Racial Integration in Duluth, appeared in the summer 2020 issue of Minnesota History Magazine. And it's a real special treat for me to have him, for all of us to have him here in person to discuss this important research project. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. Montrie.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Everyone keeps welcoming me. This is like okay, I might just stay in Minnesota. That doesn't happen in Boston that often. People say, hey, welcome to Boston. I also want to thank everybody for putting this event together, Dr. Cooley and Malik, especially. This is probably one of the best organized book talks I've done since I published the book in April. It's a real delight to be walking around campus here. My university, the University of Massachusetts Lowell, looks a lot like Mankato and at Minnesota State University in Mankato. And so I kind of feel almost like I'm back home. And yesterday, my students didn't have to go to class, so it's almost like I'm kind of back and doing my job. But also the event sponsors, the Department of History, the Gender Studies Program, the Kessel Peace Institute, African American Affairs, and Department of Government. I'm going to do a little bit of background as far as how I came to write this book, Whiteness in Plain View, and then talk about some examples of racial exclusion in Minnesota, and use some images that you'll see up on the screen here. Say a few things about the implications of this history and the legacy and how it's with us today in the present. And then we should have time for you to offer up any comments or make observations and ask questions, including the people that are watching this on Zoom. I already met with some people, some students as well as faculty earlier today, and so they've heard some of what I'm going to say. But I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, and I actually grew up in a subdivision in the eastern part of Jefferson County, which is outside of the city, and the subdivision was called Plainview. And so the title of my book is sort of a play on the subdivision where I grew up, which my dad, who was a real estate developer, had a hand in developing. And our house was one of the first houses there in the subdivision. For the most part, Plainview was an all-white place. It was an all-white community, with a couple of exceptions. Across the street, directly across the street from our house, was the Rice family, who are African American. However, when the subdivision filled in, the other white families that moved in around our house, many of the families sent their kids to the same school. In the summertime, the kids were in and out of each other's houses. The adults socialized together. They had block parties where they'd block off a street. And the Rice family never was involved in any of this. The Rice family included Butch, who was about my age. I never played with Butch. He never came to my house. I never went to his house. And at the time, as a kid, growing up this way, without any real racial consciousness, I didn't ask the right questions. I wondered why the Rice family was there. I wondered why they were so reserved and didn't try to associate with us. I was lacking the ability to see what was right in front of me, right? Fortunately, as I became a teenager, I got involved with some social activists in the city, many of them coming out of the Black Civil Rights Movement of the 1930s and 40s and 50s, including Ann Braden. And they helped me understand the history of racial segregation in the United States, including in places like Louisville and in Kentucky, and put my personal experience in proper perspective. And then as I became more involved in activism, I went to college. I was able to work with people at the university, professors who themselves also had come out of the social movements of the 1960s and 70s. They'd been involved in Black civil rights activism with SNCC and CORE. They had been involved in anti-war activism, women's rights and women's liberation activism. And they were models for me, especially the ones in the history department, for studying American life, as an academic, as a scholar, in order to make change in the present, right? That you could study the past, you could study American labor history, you could study race in America in the 19th, 20th century and connect it to how we got to be where we are today in the present time. I finished grad school, went on to grad school and finished grad school in 2001 and did a year of a postdoc in Memphis, Tennessee. And while I was there, I started paying attention to the neighborhood I was in and decided, at that point, I was an environmental historian mostly, that I'd take a look at how racial exclusion and segregation in that part of Memphis had implications for people's exposure to toxic waste and environmental hazards. So that's really my first kind of experience with doing research about racial exclusion, but I didn't really keep it going. And so for like the next 10, 15 years, I wasn't thinking about racial exclusion. But I decided at a certain point that I'd make a shift back to that, using the Memphis article sort of as a launch into a more focused examination of racial exclusion. And part of what was making me do that was what happened in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, when white police officer Darren Wilson killed African-American Michael Brown. Like many of you and other people in the country, I was interested to know what happened. How did this happen? Why did it happen? But as an historian, I wanted to know something. I wanted to know something about the deep history or the longer history of Ferguson and St. Louis County in Missouri. And what I found, because other scholars had already started working on this, is that there's quite a complicated story of racial exclusion in the community in Ferguson and connected to the neighborhood or the community right next to Ferguson called Kinloch, and where there was actually a large population of African Americans and as well as some whites, and those people got displaced by an airport expansion, and many African Americans ended up moving into Ferguson starting in the 1980s. And that was the part that was the beginning of producing a lot of racial tension in Ferguson, because whites had up to that point lived with this idea that they could live in an all-white place. And so when Darren Wilson confronted Michael Brown, and when he killed Michael Brown, what I understood then from that is this wasn't just two individuals, right? This was historical forces meeting each other. And when Darren Wilson was not convicted of a crime, that wasn't just an individual miscarriage of justice. So I sort of feeling compelled, I would do racial exclusion as a new area of research. But I'd grown up in the South. I had taught for a year in the South. I knew about Ferguson, which is in the South, but I didn't want to tell another story about the South. I wanted to think about or be a part or participant in a conversation that was already happening about how racism is manifested in the North, in the United States, including in an urban North, right? And so I talked to some people about this and asked them, well, what would you do? What would you look at? Where would you look in the North to try to tell a compelling story about racial exclusion's history? And Jim Lowen, who's a historical sociologist, and maybe some of you've heard of him, he wrote a book called Sundown Towns. Before that, Lies My Teacher Told Me. He immediately suggested Minnesota. And he said that because that is a place where at least many white people would not think that there would be a history, a deep history, a persistent history of racism, and it would be counterintuitive, and it would demonstrate what you're trying to do. So I got involved in the research, started doing work in archives, and started piecing the story together. I looked at many different cities and towns and suburbs all across the state, carried the story from the 19th century into the 20th century, and found all kinds of elements and dimensions to how white people kept African Americans out of their communities or removed them if they were there, and then kept them out in the decades following. What I discovered in doing this, in looking at each of these examples, as I went to archives in the Twin Cities, to Austin, to Duluth, that racial exclusion in Minnesota, first of all, isn't an accident, that it is very intentional. That when you're in an all-white space, you have an all-white community, that just doesn't occur on its own, right? It's evidence itself that something happened, right? And that it is not incidental. I didn't have to go searching around to find examples of racial exclusion in Minnesota. The examples that you see in my book in the different chapters are not exceptional. I'm not picking the cases where there was a lot of racism, and then the other side of that being that, well, if you in all the other communities that aren't in the book, there's not the same history. That in fact, it is a thing that is very widespread. And it is very persistent. It lasts through time. And you could study, as some students and faculty are here and in other parts of Minnesota, you could study other communities that I don't talk about as much in my book. I actually start the book, chapter 1, by looking at the history of southern Minnesota from the early to mid 19th century and detail the genocide and displacement orchestrated by white traders and soldiers and missionaries and settler colonists against Native Americans. Which perhaps maybe you would ask the question, well, why in a book about white people excluding African Americans that this is the beginning of your story? I look at the way in which African Americans, people of African ancestry, Native Americans, and whites are kind of entangled with one another. It's not racially egalitarian entanglement, but there's a way that their lives are entangled with one another up to the US-Dakota War of 1862, which is also happening at the same time as the Civil War, right? I believe, or I would argue, that both of those wars are about white people trying to protect what they call white supremacy, right? Enslavers in the South trying to protect slavery, racial slavery, and white people in Minnesota experiencing the result of a long history of, exploitation and oppression and disregard, marginalization, land theft against Dakota and other indigenous people. Whites respond to this. This is essentially a race war. Whites respond to what Native Americans do with concentration camps. They find Native Americans, round them up, and put them in concentration camps. Then they put people that were involved in battles on trial, and they find that they want to execute after this about 300 Native Americans. Fortunately, President Lincoln asked for the trial records, and he went through that and narrowed that down to 39. And then one of those people had a stay of their execution, so that when they executed people in Mankato, there were 38 people killed, hanged. This is the largest mass execution in US history. And then following that, there's forced removal. I believe this is the beginning of racial exclusion in Minnesota, right? And it is a story that's important in its own right, but especially for readers unfamiliar with Minnesota history, what I wanted to do is establish that this is the context for understanding the racism that is then directed against African Americans in Minnesota in the 2 centuries that follow, right? That if you think about African Americans who are moving from, especially those moving from the South to places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, and other parts of the upper Midwest, that this is going on right before, and it's still very raw and very much in the minds of white people as they see Black migrants appear, or as they think about the possibility that Black migrants might show up, and they organize themselves, as I said, sort of to continue to protect what they call white supremacy. So there are a number of Black migrants that move into Minnesota. This is a census manuscript page. This is your first test. Everybody has to read a line of this before we move on to the next slide. Some of you are doing family history, genealogy, you've seen something like this. As part of my research, I got an Ancestry.com membership, and I was looking through census manuscript pages. It's a great way to procrastinate, right? I love using Ancestry.com, but it is also a great historical resource for understanding things like this. This is from the 1880 manuscript. For those of you who don't know what this is basically the record that the census taker keeps as they're walking around from house to house, street to street, recording who is living in each place that they go to. And then this becomes the data that they use to come up with sort of the general information for the census. This page shows a part of Austin, Minnesota. And on the bottom of this page, I'll take this microphone out of here. Is that okay? At the bottom of this page, they've listed George Weber and his wife, Mary, and their 2 sons, George and John, and they are African Americans. George is a barber, which is a common occupation for African Americans in the 19th century in Minnesota. And he came from Ohio. He is one of several African Americans living in Austin at this point. And the number increased over the next couple of decades so that they reach a high number of a dozen in 1910. And that is stable until 1920. And that's the highest it will be. After that, after 1920, it begins to decline, and it never gets back to that until the 1970s. And part of the reason why it declined in the 1920s, it started to decline in the 1920s and never increased again until the 1970s, is because of what happened here at the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul railroad yards and roundhouse. So in 1922, railroad workers across the nation went on strike, including those at the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad in Austin. And initially in July, the company brought in some strikebreakers who were white, and they housed them in the roundhouse. Workers didn't do anything to stop them from working in the rail yard at the time, But then a few days later, the company brought in more strikebreakers who were African American, and that caused the white railroad workers to have a meeting and then to organize themselves and to drive the people that were in the roundhouse out of town. And when they did this, they made it very clear that they were mostly upset about the race of the strikebreakers who had been brought in. This is the Austin Daily Herald. This is an excerpt from July 21st, 1922. And the headline reads, "Negro workers driven out of rail shops." 13 Negroes employed at the Milwaukee Railroad shops yesterday morning in the place of men now on strike were driven from the city at 7:45 o'clock last night, when over 100 striking shopcraft workmen and sympathizers stormed the shops and roundhouse and warned the imported workers to flee the city without delay. The advice was readily taken, and 4 white workmen employed at the same time, the Negroes were brought to the city, are also reported to have given up their jobs. A parade of the strikers through the main streets of the city preceded the rushing of the roundhouse, which followed as a spontaneous upshot of the day's discussion among some of the pickets and other striking members who took offense at the action of the company in importing colored workmen, right? That their race is really what mattered. The parade was brief, but it caused much commotion, for the shopmen, as they marched through the streets, asked of laymen if they wanted Austin to be a Negro town. One of the leaders of the union even says that we're not going to tolerate having a black belt in the city of Austin, right, with a dozen black strikebreakers. Somehow that was going to lead to some large population of African Americans in town. The strikers and their supporters entered from the east side of the railroad yards, going across the overhead bridge in a large body and filling into the yards orderly but with a rush. A person who's involved in this, John Winkles, who later did an oral history interview because he was an important part of the United Packing House Workers Union, he talks about what he did, and it's he and his brother or his cousin go in with clubs, and they do hit people and beat people and send them on their way. It is a violent removal. And that is still fresh in people's minds into the next month, in August 8th, 1922, when some residents of the West End in Austin run a black couple out of town, also basically by threatening them with violence. They don't actually use violence, but now that whites have used violence against blacks, the threat has a lot of potency, right? This couple is probably Isaac and Jenny Bailey, and they are in their 70s. They're elderly. From what I can tell in terms of looking at the census, who would have been living in the West End, there aren't that many black residents in Austin, so it's probably those two who were run out of town. And as you can see in this excerpt, it's not clear what they were doing that bothered white people so much. The white people say it's not their race that mattered, but the fact that they had to cover themselves in that way probably suggests that it's very much likely about the fact that they're black. Gone but not forgotten, goodwill to men and women, a sign tacked on the door of the deserted house between Moscow and Grove Streets on 7th Street, occupied by the colored family, against whom protest has been made by neighbors who declared that they were maintaining a nuisance, gave the above expression of farewell to the residents who ordered them out of the neighborhood. Complaint that the family was maintaining a nuisance in the neighborhood led to the appearance of a number of residents before the city council, as well as complaints to the police. No action was taken, however, and the indignant residents took matters into their own hands. On Sunday night, they visited the home of the colored family and warned them to leave by 5 o'clock the next evening. Indignant residents who were interviewed declared that race feeling was not the motive for their warning. We had no objection to the fact that the people were colored, one of the residents who had joined the protest said, and we would not have taken any action if they had behaved themselves. What we objected to was their maintaining a nuisance in the neighborhood. We want to keep our section of the city clean, and similar action will be taken if any further disturbance occurs. This will be a thing that you see, and if some of you read the book, will find in other examples across Minnesota. White people often condition their opposition to black people either in their community or that they want to remove or show up. They'll have other explanations for what they're trying to do in terms of removing African Americans or keeping African Americans out, that they say it's not about race, that they're not racist, right? That when they object to, say, Marion Taylor trying to move into Morningside outside of Minneapolis, they say it's because the property he's trying to buy needs to be used for drainage. But they also very at other times reveal that in fact what they don't want is a black family in their community, right? And so this is just an example of something that's repeated again and again. After this point, There are very few African Americans in Austin, probably maybe half a dozen over the next few decades, as the city's population doubled to 28,000 in the 1930s. And that's partly because white people, as I said, they continue to do the work of maintaining the whiteness and exclusion. They have to, this is something that they have to do over and over again, or they have to declare and sort of, they can't ever rest, right? If they stopped with their expressions of racism, then it's likely that their community would not continue to be all white. One of the ways that they do this in Austin and other parts of Minnesota is to organize chapters of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the first Ku Klux Klan was established in the 19th century after the Civil War. And because there were still federal troops in the South during Reconstruction, that Klan was shut down. They were put some of the leaders on trial, put them in jail. And it's not until the 20th century you have another version of the Klan show up after D.W. Griffith released his movie Birth of a Nation, which is basically an apology for the Klan, why it was that the Klan had to be organized in order to restore order in the South. It's the first movie, the first feature-length film shown in the White House by President Wilson, who was formerly a governor of New Jersey, but before that was an historian, and as an historian had also written about why the Klan had to be established in the South for this reason. So some people are inspired by this movie to start a new Ku Klux Klan. They proclaimed the Klan's refounding in Georgia at Stone Mountain, outside of Atlanta, but they moved the headquarters to Indianapolis. And that's telling because where they understand this new Klan is going to be not just a Southern thing, but also focus on what's going on in the rest of the country. And they draw a lot of members in other parts of other regions of the US, and not just rural, but also urban residents, including in Austin. And so this is the front page of the Call of the North. This is the Klan newspaper for Minnesota. It's replaced by the Minnesota Fiery Cross, but for a year, this is their newspaper. And it is described, again, if somebody can please just read, you can read the first lines in the story. They're from back in the back. The headline is telling you that they're having a meeting outside of Austin, because when they first go into Austin and try to get permission to use the fairgrounds, they were denied. There is opposition to the Klan in Minnesota, not only in Austin, but other places. But that doesn't really have, it's not because white people were, were opposed to the Klan's racism, but rather because this new Klan also was going out and attacking immigrants. They're especially concerned with the new wave of immigration that was happening after the 1890s, and especially those immigrants who are Catholic or who weren't Protestant Christian. And when they're doing that, they're actually antagonizing a group of people that's large enough and in some cases powerful enough to respond and fight back. So people in Austin refuse them permission to use the fairgrounds. Instead, they get a farmer who lives off of Turtle Creek to let them use his land. And they have more than 1,000 people show up at this initiation ceremony. The Klan actually went into decline in the 1920s. It has its last state meeting in Minnesota in 1927, but it leaves a cultural and institutional legacy. And that is certainly still very evident in the 1930s when workers at Hormel began to organize a union. Some of the same people, including John Winkles, who had been involved in the violent removal of African Americans in the railroad shopman strike in 1922, are also leaders of the militant group that forms the union at Hormel. And Winkles claims in his oral history, in fact, that at one point the company, for some reason, brought in about 40 African Americans to work there, and they were living out in the woods outside of the city, and that he and a bunch of other white people went, just as they did in 1922, they went out to the woods and they told these workers, you need to be gone by tomorrow or we're going to come back and we will harm you. And they left. That's the only evidence I have that actually happens. And I don't know how much I want to believe John Winkles when he tells stories, but he did tell the story and seemed not in any way reluctant to relate the fact that he was involved again in this racist violence. Of course, Hormel was organized in 1933 after a 3-day sit-down strike. They get a contract, and with that contract, they begin to build up, increased advances in terms of improved wages, in terms of better hours, in terms of benefits. But think about how all of those jobs, those well-paid, benefited jobs, those are only for white people. There are no African Americans working at Hormel, and there will not be any African Americans working at Hormel even in the mid 1980s when the workers go on strike there in 1985. If you look at the pictures of the strike, there aren't any black workers on the picket lines because there aren't any black workers there. There had been some black workers at Hormel in the years before the railroad shopman strike, but they were gone by the 1930 census. In fact, in 1980, just before the strike, the African American population in Austin was under 30. By 1990, when the population of Austin was 21,000, there were still only 47 African Americans living there. Another place where racist violence is part of racial exclusion is Duluth. And that's where I go in the next chapter after the Austin chapter, chapter 4. And this is also a place, though, where I try to tell the story as I do in Austin by going beyond just the moment of racist violence. So like I don't stop in 1922 or in the 1930s in Austin, but I tell the story on into the 1960s and 70s. And I also try to tell the story in Duluth as far as racial exclusion beyond 1920. African Americans are first, let's see if this maybe it's the next slide here. African Americans are first recruited to Duluth, or some of the first African Americans who show up in Duluth are recruited to work at the steel plant, the Minnesota steel plant. But they were only allowed to take certain jobs. None of them were allowed to work in the office. They all worked in what they call the yards. And for the most part, other jobs in Duluth were closed to them, especially the unionized industrial employment. And African Americans were allowed to live only in certain parts of Duluth, the central and east hillside areas, downtown, and in Gary. They were not allowed to live, for instance, in the company housing that the steel plant built. This is Morgan Park, which is right next to Gary. This is all white. The company said that they would not practice segregation in terms of opening up this housing, having this housing allowed only to whites, but that is actually what happened. And so there are no African Americans living in Morgan Park. They all live in Gary. So Gary is all black. And this is the background to, I'll go back to this slide, the lynching that happens in the summer of 1920. When a circus came into town and black circus workers were accused of raping a white woman, the sheriff, the police chief took black workers off of the circus train. They arrested a number of them, put them in jail, and whites, at least 5,000 whites show up in the middle of town, and some of them drag 3 of the circus workers out of jail and lynch them on a utility pole right where the sign is, East First Street. And this is a plaque that is by that spot. And then across, you can kind of see on the right, there's a memorial to the 3 men who were lynched. Now, the whites actually immediately after this talk about removing all African Americans from Duluth. There are whites that are organizing to do this, but fortunately, the local officials mobilized the National Guard. They called in the National Guard, and the National Guard starts patrolling the black neighborhood to keep whites out. And the other thing is that the black population by that point is about 400. So in a way that's a little different from Austin, it's just simply too large probably for whites to run them all out. So what they do instead is they compromise with the idea that they'll just enforce a very strict color line. And continue to bar African Americans from certain jobs and contain them in only certain sections of town. One of the things they do in Duluth is to organize their own Klan chapter at the Owls Social Club. This is still there. It's right next, it's actually a couple blocks down the street from where the lynching happened. And Duluth actually has one of the largest Klan chapters in the state of Minnesota. When they first organized, they have about 700 founding members, and that doubles within a year to about 1,400, I think, in 1924, including about 24 police officers, right? So some of the police officers who were involved in policing, as well as some of them who were supposedly had been protecting the workers in the jail from the mob, they are members of the Ku Klux Klan. And I'm going to show you a picture that is probably going to be shocking to you, and I'll warn you now. But they also do things like perform minstrel shows, right? So minstrel shows are blackface minstrel shows are quite popular throughout Minnesota into the 1960s at least. And that's certainly true in Duluth. This is a program for a minstrel show at the Denfield High School auditorium in 1958. And Denfield is actually where a lot of the white working class men who were probably the main perpetrators in the lynching, they were coming from. They got together in a pool hall and rode some trucks into the downtown and got the guys out of jail and then lynched them. So this cultural expression of racism is part of sustaining the color line, and it's also kind of telling you, that the hatred, that was behind the racial violence and the lynching continues on into the late 1950s and 60s, and people don't question this. I mean, African Americans do, but white people don't question the fact that they're doing blackface minstrel shows. There's also ironic expressions like there's a social club that Jewish residents start because they're not allowed in other social clubs, and they actually have their own minstrel shows at the Jewish social club. Like I said, I take the story into the 1960s, and I highlight the work that this family did to try to desegregate a part of Duluth. This picture shows on the right Matt Carter and Helen Carter and their kids. They're originally from Mississippi, and they moved to Chicago and then to Duluth in 1960. And Helen actually became the first African-American teacher in the Duluth school system in 1961, I think. Before that, there are no Black teachers in the school system in Duluth. Matt worked on lake boats out of two harbors. He couldn't get a job out of the hiring hall in Duluth because that was barred to African Americans. There are plenty of African Americans working on lake boats, and they all have to go and get hired out of two harbors. Because of where Helen is teaching and the fact that Matt has to go to two harbors to get on his boat, they decide that they will try to buy some property on London Road, which is down by the lake. And there's property for sale there, but the white owner of the property refused to sell it to them once he realized that Matt and Helen were Black. So they get a local minister to be a straw purchaser for them, and he buys it. And then Matt and Helen decide that they'll get the permit to build the house. But whites organized to stop them from doing this. And like I said, they often will come up with other reasons why they want to block an African-American family from moving into their neighborhood. And in this case, what they do is they say that if Matt builds his house in the way that he was planning on it, it'll cause all these traffic problems. It'll make the road unsafe. And then they actually put together a petition that all the neighbors sign. And then I have the petition, and I wrote out the names of the people, because one of the other things I want to do in the book is to make racial exclusion and the people that were involved in it real. I want to show that real individual people did this. That, when you look at the pictures, for instance, of the lynching in Duluth, there are a lot of pictures. Those are real people. They're a part of a so-called mob, but they're individuals, and we don't know their names. Right? And we need to know their names as part of the reckoning, as part of the acknowledgement of what happened. I think that this has to become part of the record, part of the narrative, right? And some of these people are probably still alive. And this has something to do too with where I hope this book will go, that it becomes part of a lot of other resources that people have at hand to make the case that white people have a responsibility, that they have culpability, and they have a responsibility to do something about what happened in the past. that white people can't just say that it happened a long time ago and had nothing to do with them personally, because in fact, it probably does. There's a way that we can draw a line back to something in time, to the present moment, even from individuals to other individuals, right? And in fact, the Carter family continued to be an anomaly on London Road. There aren't any other African-American residents in that area. 40 years later, after the 1960s, there were more African-Americans living below the poverty line in Duluth than there were in the 1960s, and only a small fraction of Black homeowners compared to a large majority of whites. So things had not really progressed much in Duluth. And these are examples of racial exclusion, but they are part of a larger story in which, by mid-century, you can look at, communities across the state. Whites in Austin, Duluth, elsewhere, were all doing things, sometimes the same thing, sometimes different things, to keep African Americans out of where, their neighborhoods or even their town or their city. And they're often doing it outside of the law or contravening the law. Right? The racist violence is against the law. I mean, it's harming other people, right? The permit opposition is kind of working within the system, but when white people don't have the law on their side, it doesn't matter. They still figure out ways to do exclusion. So for instance, in 1948, the United States Supreme Court ruled that racial restrictive covenants were not that they were unconstitutional, but that state courts couldn't enforce them, right? So after 1948, restrictive covenants don't have any power, in the sense that whites could invoke them to keep African Americans out of their neighborhood. And if you think about it, a lot of the suburbanization that happens in this country after World War II is happening after 1948, right? With the GI Bill and other things allowing whites to build homes in the outskirts of cities. And those communities still go all white. And so they went all white without restrictive covenants. In 1953, the state of Minnesota passed a law that barred any new restrictive covenants, sort of further solidifying that was not going to be a tool anymore. In 1961, the state legislature passed a fair housing bill that went into effect in 1962. So there are some protections that African Americans have in terms of challenging racism they might face when they're looking for apartments or looking for homes. There are some exceptions that make the law not the strongest law it could be. But then in 1968, the United States Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, right, which closes all of the gaps in the Minnesota state law. And still, through the 60s into the 70s, you have racial exclusion. Now, I make this point because I do think we need to pay attention to policy, and we need to pay attention to the way that the local, state, and federal governments played a role in racial exclusion and how they supported white people in practicing exclusion. But I also want to challenge that to some extent. Some of you might have also read a book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And he says very explicitly at the beginning of his book that he wanted to frame all segregation as de jure, as a result of the state. And the reason he wanted to do that is because he said, if you can show that it's a result of the state action, then you can also make a claim on the state for reparations. That if the state is responsible, then the state has to pay. And I am sympathetic with that because I also want to move the reparations movement forward. But I think that this simplifies history. This creates a mythology. It overlooks something that's very important. It runs the risks of understating the extent to which policy and law actually reflected and sustained and reinforced popular white will and its evolving extra-legal exercise. Local governments, state governments, federal governments didn't make white people practice exclusion. They just came to the aid of white people. And when those governments didn't come to the aid of the white people anymore, the white people continued to do what they were trying to do all along, just with different tools. And this is, as I said, it's important for us to have a clear understanding of how the history played out, and then to figure out what we're going to do as far as addressing racism and its historical legacy in the present, what the scope of our efforts should be and how it should be done, and not only in Minnesota, but also in the United States as a whole. I am not trying to suggest that Minnesota is unusual or that it's an outlier in terms of the upper Midwest or in the North or in the United States. It's an example of what's going on elsewhere in the country. And so our conversation has to be a national one. And I end the introduction to the book this way. Even now, after George Floyd's murder and the public protest that ignited, many readers will be surprised that racial hatred and racial inequality have been such a fundamental part of Minnesota's past. But Whiteness in Plain View reveals the way long-standing assumptions about regional distinctions based on race are off the mark, if not a lie. And that raises fundamental questions about the country as a whole. The ghosts of racial exclusion are all around us. If they are in Minnesota, they are everywhere, wherever we are. So I think we should have enough time. If you want to make some comments or observations of your own or ask some questions, I'd be happy to answer those questions for you. And I think Dr. Cooley is going to have another microphone for the audience and also be giving me questions that might be showing up in a chat for the people that are watching by Zoom.
See, is this one working? Yes. Thank you so much. And yes, if you're on Zoom, feel free to type in questions in the question and answer, and I will be monitoring those. And then if you're here in the auditorium with us, just raise your hand and I will hustle up there to give you the microphone. Okay, looks like we've got one up here.
Did you all watch the Donahue Show? When I was a kid, I loved the Donahue Show.
So I know your focus has been on Minnesota. My daughter goes to Marquette University in Milwaukee.
Mhm.
I'm just wondering why it's so segregated still today. Can you speak on that?
I don't know much about it, but there is, I have a scholar colleague, or she's not in my department in Massachusetts, but I've hosted her as a speaker on our campus, Christy Clark Pujara, and she's working on at least doing the 19th century history of Wisconsin in a very similar way to what I've done. I think she's probably getting ready to start publishing some parts of that research, and so you might look for her work, Christy Clark Pujara. But what I do know is that it's not very different. Yeah. Yes.
Some
Sorry.
mic up there. I don't think it shows up on Zoom if there's no mic.
I'm just curious if you've heard from anybody in Mankato about our history of racial exclusion in our own way in Mankato. And if you're aware that we're doing a study of the housing covenants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talked about that a little earlier today, and Dr. Cooley is very involved in that, as are some of the students who I met with for lunch. And so I think it's very exciting to hear that was something they were starting to do in the Twin Cities, right, with the Mapping Prejudice Project, and I think it's great that you're doing it here. And I'll be very interested to know what you find. I was talking to people in Austin last night. I did a talk in Austin, and they were saying they're starting to do some of that themselves. Some of these people just individually trying to figure out whether their deeds have racial covenants on them. And then it would be interesting to know, like, first of all, how extensive they were, where they are, but also, as I was suggesting to some people at lunch, how they were challenged, right? Because another thing that does happen is the African Americans are pretty constantly bringing lawsuits and in other ways trying to get around the covenants, right? They don't just get put on a deed and then everyone obeys them. They're actually, they're very contentious. And sometimes even African Americans will be able to buy a house that white people thought was protected with a covenant from having that happen, and it doesn't work out. So by the time you get to this Shelley versus Kramer case in 1948, there's a long history of white legal action, or of black legal action against white people trying to maintain communities as all white with covenants. I also would say that those covenants are again, they're not happening in a vacuum, right? That white people are using a lot of other methods at the same time to do exclusion, and in fact, they probably don't. It's another thing to sort of try to figure out like how useful they really were to make a community all white, right? Especially because they also expired essentially in 1948. And if we don't have that in mind, if the focus becomes too narrow on covenants, then we're missing a lot of white racism, right? The history of white racism is sort of understated. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you for the shout out for the Racial Covenants Project, by the way, and everybody needs to stay tuned you'll be hearing more about that certainly in the coming months. So thank you for that. I'm going to read a question off of Zoom, and then I'm going to go up. I noticed Dr. Ping had his hand up, so I'll head up there next. Okay, this is from Zoom. Did you do any research on how racial exclusion is showing up in Minnesota today?
Yeah, so there's an epilogue to the book. I like to try to bring the chapters, each of the chapters, let's start with Austin. I do a chapter on Duluth, then a chapter on Edina, then a chapter on Rondo and St. Paul, and a chapter on Bloomington. And I try to bring each of those stories up to the 1970s or 80s. And then there's an epilogue in which I look at demographic change that is or isn't taking place into the 1990s and 21st century. But I'm not a demographer and I'm not an expert in that. And so I think there's a lot more to do with that. I do this thing where I look at, for instance, the Twin Cities, and I see more African Americans living in certain parts of the Twin Cities, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's integration happening. What I suspect is happening is that African Americans are moving outward from a central part of Minneapolis or St. Paul into neighborhoods, and white people are moving away, right? And that's not the same thing. And I think if some people in here, know how to look at things beyond the, lower than the census tract level, there's work to be done there in trying to figure out what kind of demographic transformation is taking place and whether or not you're seeing anything other than just a shifting of a population. And in fact, racial exclusion is still happening. I think it is telling that you see many more white people moving out of places. If you look at the census data, than African Americans moving in. So there is white flight, right? And again, I can use my own family as an example. Like I can remember my grandparents talking about this around the dinner table as a kid, not understanding what they meant, but they were clearly they were, and they didn't feel hesitant to do this around kids, but they were racist and they were worried about Black people moving into their neighborhood, and they were talking about moving, right? That's what they were going to do. So I would, and if somebody does do that, please get in touch with me because I really want to know the answer to some of that too. I think the epilogue is kind of just, a prompt maybe to doing a much closer and more wide-ranging investigation. And if people start working on that, like I will definitely be one of your readers. So.
I think you trace well the history of racial exclusion and related white supremacy in Minnesota. And you mentioned at the end of your speech, the racism, this kind of racial exclusion is all around everywhere in this country. Could you please actually assess the level of racial exclusion in Minnesota compared with other states, the situation in other states? In other words, Minnesota situation is better or worse, or just roughly equal compared with the other states?
Yeah. Well, it is not a comparative history. So the question is, how does Minnesota compare to other parts of the country? It's not a comparative history, and so I mean I can't really speak to that like with any kind of credibility. But in terms of knowing that history, but I did think that at one point I was going to do this would be a book in which I would look at Kentucky and Minnesota, since I'm from Kentucky, and see if there's a way that you could learn something by looking at how racial exclusion plays out in one state or another, including a place like Kentucky that is in the South. But I didn't do it that way. And I think that, again, that's another thing that a study that people could do is sort of like, again, they could do the history of Wisconsin this way, like Christy's doing, and maybe someone else could sort of add to what her work. She's mostly done 18th and 19th century American history, so she's not going to probably go into the 20th, but somebody could do that for Wisconsin in the 20th century. And then but I suspect what you'd find is it's not really that different. That in fact it's probably pretty similar. And what Minnesota does is, if it happened like this in Minnesota, that it's probably like Minnesota is a good case because it's suggesting that it's happening elsewhere. Because Minnesota has somehow acquired this reputation of being progressive on race, they have Hubert Humphrey, Walter Mondale, Roy Wilkins, and people like that, sort of national leaders, and this idea of Minnesota nice, and all these other ways in which Minnesota might have been, exceptional, and it's not exceptional. In fact, racism is fundamental. That it's probably fundamental to Wisconsin and Michigan and everywhere else that you would look at. I know that doesn't really answer your question, but I don't really have, I can't really answer your question. Yeah. I can't remember who had their hand up first, but.
I'm going to take this over here, and then we've got another one on Zoom, and then I'll look out here again.
Thank you.
Brief question, which is unusual for retired professors. Is there anything that has really, really surprised you in researching and writing the book?
Yeah, I'm still shocked by blackface minstrel show programs and pictures. And I remember I was in Edina at the archives doing, can you still hear me on the, close enough? I was in Edina doing research at the archives there, and I had asked for a number of different things, and they, in the way it worked, they'd bring them out to the table where you're at, and I didn't know that they had pictures of a blackface minstrel show that was being performed at the high school for many years into the 1950s. And the archivist came out and said, I think you want to take a look at these. And it was a brown envelope, 8x10. And it had 5 or 6 photographs, black and white glossy photographs of probably it's 100-something people, men, women, children, adults, laughing, having a good time. And it's the 1950s, and I don't know, I'm still stunned by this, like how white people got absorbed in this racist culture and did it unquestioningly in so long into the 20th century. And that's kind of what I want to do next, is look at this as part of the history of racial exclusion, how there's a culture of racial exclusion, how white people do racial exclusion and affirm their racism to themselves with things like that. And what I found is actually minstrel shows are quite popular around the state and around the country in the 20th century. Most of the literature, some of you might know this, is on minstrel shows, blackface minstrel shows, treats that as like a part of the 19th century, and that it doesn't really go much into the 20th. And I find that interesting, that also people just don't think of it as a 20th century phenomenon, but it very much is. Yeah.
1958, I believe, and that was our centennial year.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
And when they do the blackface minstrel show at, I can't remember the name of this place, but it's the Jewish Social Club. There's pictures of women who are dressed up in blackface minstrel outfits. And then I also found, like 2 or 3 years after that, Hubert Humphrey comes and does a talk about the brotherhood of man at this auditorium. And I mean, I just don't understand the cognitive dissonance that's involved in that is sort of baffling to me.
We have another question on Zoom. Does your book cover the white mob that gathered outside the Lee family house on 48th Street in Minneapolis in the 1920s?
Mm-hmm. It only briefly talks about the Lees in the Dinah chapter as part of other ways that whites were using violence or threats to stop African Americans from moving into communities in Minneapolis or just outside of Minneapolis. And not because it's not important, but because a lot of people have been talking about the Lee story, and maybe people in here are familiar with it. In fact, when I first started doing research on this project, I came to work at the Minnesota Historical Society, and I got invited to talk at the Eastside Freedom Library in St. Paul. And there were some undergraduate students there who were working on the Lee family history, and they were amazing, and they actually went and won a history prize for this. And I thought, well, I don't really have anything to add to that. They've already covered it, and so I only talk about them as kind of an example. And that's the other thing is like they're not unusual. Like that actually the Lees are having the same experience as many other Black families in that part of Minneapolis. It is important to point out in that case of the Lees, part of why whites had to, well, they didn't have to do it, right? But why whites felt like they had to do what they did to threaten the Lees is because there was not a covenant on the Lee family property, right? And the whites were at, you know, sort of challenged to get them out some other way, right? They had thought that they were going to put together a general neighborhood agreement that would keep the white homeowner that sold the house to the Lees from doing that, but that they didn't do that in time, and so then they had to use threats and violence against the Lees to do that. To me, that's an important part of the Lees story.
I'm wondering if you can, and you mentioned cognitive dissonance, and in Minnesota, how this idea or this notion of us being so progressive, and this concept of Minnesota nice, which is not really nice, but it's to many people it is nice, right? How does this history of Minnesotans seeing themselves in one way juxtaposition to the racial exclusion and all the things that you are talking about and writing about that in our history, I'm curious about your thoughts about like, how do you see this getting past that? Because it is so difficult in a lot of circles to have these kinds of conversations and for people to simultaneously like who see themselves as one thing. But now we have this long protracted history that isn't any better. It may be different, but it isn't any better than the history we saw in the South, whether it's through slavery and through Jim Crow and segregation. And to me, that just seems like that this is the real challenge that a lot of us have to have that conversation.
Right. Well, I think partly like doing things like the Covenant Project is important. I also am in touch with people that are in Hastings who are doing a project they call Building Remembrance for Reconciliation. There's ways that you can get into the history and have community conversations that help get us to a place where we're doing something like truth and reconciliation. But it is going to be very difficult. In the Austin talk that I did last night, I showed them some other slides I didn't show you where, the United Packing House Workers of America is known for being very involved in the Black Civil Rights Movement, and the leadership of the UPWA by the 1950s were people from Austin. Ralph Hellstein and Frank Schultz, the president and vice president of the union, were the leaders of the union in Austin, and they're leading the union that is doing all this work. The packing house workers are known for being very advanced on Black civil rights, partly because they have so many Black members, right? And the Black members are demanding that they deal with segregation and voter disenfranchisement, but they don't question has happened in Austin, right? And then later on, they do set up like the Austin Committee on Human Rights, and they say, well, we've thought about it and studied it, and we realize actually, as it turns out, there's only 2 Black families in town, and they never have a problem finding housing, so there's no problem. Not looking at the fact that Austin is all white, and there's a big problem that is much deeper, right? So how you get beyond that, even when those people who are kind of progressive in their own, they think they're progressive in their own thinking, they're liberal-minded, they can't see what's right in front of them. That's partly why I titled the book the way I did, right? For white people, it's very hard to see this. When you do see it, though, it's kind of hard not to see it everywhere. I feel like that when I go around. To me, it's very obvious now, right? Probably it wasn't always obvious to me. Like as I said, as a kid, I didn't see it I didn't see it right in front of me in my neighborhood. Making that turn is important, and you can do that with historical facts. Like I do interpret history. But a lot of what I've done tonight and what I do in the book is just telling people facts. And this is what makes other people uncomfortable. My sister is involved in a group called No Left Turn in Education, which is part of the effort to stop what they say, the teaching of critical race theory in schools. So she's basically, working against me in our own vocations and our careers. And my mom thinks we're both wonderful, and she wants me to recognize that my sister is doing great work too. And I was like, well, you can't say that it's not possible. You can have both of us be right at the same time. But she talks a lot about theory, right? Critical race theory. And I think they do that. She does that in the group that she's a part of, because I think they believe that theory is debatable. And it is, like, maybe it's a little more like, this kind of thing where people can have a range of opinions on a theory, but they can't, and people can challenge what I told you tonight or what I wrote in the book. But if you do, you have to have other evidence. You have to have sources to show me other historical facts that somehow make these historical facts not add up to what they add up to in my interpretation. People really did file a permit to stop the Carters from building their house on London Road. And people really did perform blackface minstrel shows into the 1950s, right? And what does that add up to? And so I think getting those facts out and then let people rest with them, white people, and see what they think they're going to do about it. That's probably at least the most that I can do as an historian. But you can all write my sister a letter and tell her that I'm right. And my mom, because I tried to get my mom to be one of the people on the back of the book jacket saying, this book is great, but she's not going to do that, because then she'd have to question my sister's work. But
So I helped work on the mapping project a little bit, just like a relatively small sample size, like 30 deeds. And one thing I noticed was like there was almost like an equal amount of covenants against racial covenants, surprisingly. But I think, like you said, it's partly like you have to consider the population, which I think was pretty low in Mankato, like the Black population up until like the 80s at least. But what I'm wondering about is what did you find on Native Americans' presence in deeds, I guess, and if you think like them not even being in an economic situation to like get houses in like white neighborhoods like played a role in them not being mentioned in the deeds.
that's a good point. I'd never seen Native Americans mentioned in a restrictive covenant, a racial covenant. Maybe if someone finds that, maybe that would be something to share with all the rest of us who are interested in this history. But I've never seen them show up in that. Sometimes Chinese is included in the list, Jews. But after 1919, the state of Minnesota passed a law that took Jews out as a category from restrictive covenants. So in fact, that's part of the explanation for why so many white Jews moved to St. Louis Park. They can actually buy homes there that maybe they wouldn't have been able to buy before. And many of them are moving out of parts of Minneapolis where African Americans move into their neighborhoods, right? Which also is eventually where the 35W is built. And then blacks get displaced from that. But there are different versions of the restrictive covenants over time, but I've never seen Native Americans mentioned in one. It could be for the reason that you say. I mean, there are Native Americans obviously around in the state of Minnesota, and I don't really continue that story. And again, it's not because it's not important, but I actually didn't feel like I had the ability to tell both the story of all people of color or all people that might be experiencing white racism. At the same time, I had to focus only on African Americans to really get that story, clear. And it's so complicated. That itself is complicated to understand and to research and understand. So I think there's still a lot that could be done as far as telling the story of Native Americans in Minnesota in the 20th century. And it certainly is going to have to involve like housing discrimination that they might experience, and which is only part of what what's going on for them. But yeah. I know that doesn't answer your question either. But.
Did that? Yeah, there we go. Thanks very much. Again, I can't wait to read the book. And you kind of just answered the question that I was going to ask, which is essentially the question of how much the story you tell is the story of racial exclusion targeted towards African Americans, particularly in Minnesota. But the reason for asking that is maybe just to get a little more at the whiteness in your title, if that makes sense. The extent to which white supremacy that you find is revolving around some kind of, African American specifically as the other, versus how much the whiteness you're talking about is instead all others.
Yeah. From what I found, white people in Minnesota are very much, they're overwhelmed. Their concern about African Americans is very large in a way that sort of, it's very much disproportionate also to the presence of African Americans, right? And one of the things I found, again, this is another topic or area that someone could explore, and I think it would be a great study, dissertation, book. But despite the fact that there's racial exclusion in various communities, there's a lot of interracial relationships and marriages that show up in records, including census. And I don't know how that exists at the same time with the story that I also know about a community like where there's violence to drive Blacks out, or where there's like active efforts to keep Blacks out by covenants or whatever. Why that's happening, or why that's still happening. At the same time, I'm finding, I find evidence, especially like in the 1960s, as integration is sort of on the horizon for many places, white people saying the main thing that they're afraid of, if African Americans move into Morningside or Edina or Bloomington or some parts of suburbs of St. Paul, is that the kids will start associating with one another and then you'll have interracial marriage, then what? And white people are really afraid of, like, they're just, for some reason, like they have this idea that Black people want to live by them to have sex, like, and where this idea comes from, but that they're really worried about this, right? And that is they only talk about it in terms of race of African Americans, right? That this is, and that's in Birth of a Nation, right? Like D.W. Griffith is also, like, that's the main story that explains why the Klans formed in the movie Birth of a Nation, is that there's this Black soldier that tries to rape this white woman. Instead of getting raped, she jumps to her death off a cliff. And then this Confederate colonel says, okay, what do we need to do to protect our white women, and their purity? We need to form a Klan, right? And that just continues in the 20th century into even places like Edina. So I do talk a little bit about other groups, including Latinos, Hispanic residents of Minnesota. And so like in Austin, for instance, in 1990, when there's 749 African Americans there, by that point, there's more than 3,000 Hispanic residents. So clearly these groups have a different history, right? And not necessarily, Hispanics aren't escaping white racism or ethnic prejudice, but there's something else going on that keeps the Black population fairly small, and at the same time, there's like a pretty significant increase in the number of Hispanic residents, right? Last night, I was talking about this with somebody, and they were saying, oh, well, there are a lot of white people in Austin that say, oh, when that happened is during and after the strike, that a bunch of Hispanic people showed up, and they took all these jobs at Hormel. And they said, actually, if you look at it, that's not true, that Hispanic population only really started to grow in the 1990s. But that is now this story that white people are telling about, and kind of like the story that about like labor history in Austin from before. Oh, Hispanic people probably somehow, undermine the strike for people on the picket line, but that's just not what happened, right? But is that what you meant, or okay?
Okay, we have another question on Zoom, so I'll read that off. Because this is extremely relevant to Mankato, what is your take on land recognitions? A lot of Mankato organizations, including our campus, always recognize that we are on Dakota land. Do you think that actually does anything to heal anyone or to increase inclusion?
We talked about this a little at lunch as well. I think land acknowledgements are good, and there are different versions of them, but I do think that they should include I mean, to the extent that you can, and like sort of making an introduction at a public event, that you're not just on lands where there were occupants and stewards that are no longer there, but also acknowledging why they're not there, or why they're not there in the same numbers, or how it is that other people made a claim to that land. And that's a history of genocide. It's a history of stealing land. It's a history of displacement. To talk about the historical agents that are involved in making something else and making that different, and in terms of, you know, why those occupants aren't there, why those stewards aren't there anymore, at least not in the numbers they were. And I think that's also true of, you know, like places like Edina that are now starting to recognize that there were, you know, a number of Black families that were farmers there in the 19th century, and then Edina went all white when they built suburbs, suburban neighborhoods. It's great that they renamed a park, you know, after one of the Black families, but that misses like also like a huge part of Edina's history, which is, well, why aren't there African Americans in Edina and Morningside anymore in the 1960s, right? Like there's a way there's a new way of covering up the racism that celebrating one Black family by naming a park after them, or acknowledging lands, you know, in a place where you are in a Minnesota State University or somewhere that, you know, there were Native American occupants, is also covering something up. There's a way that that's covering up. And so, yeah, I would say that maybe it would be helpful to go the next step and say explicitly that there's another part of the story. But even that still isn't doing anything, right? Like it's communicating and it's framing and maybe helping reinterpret history for people. But we need to do things. We need to be part of a movement to make reparations, not only for African Americans, but for Native Americans as well. And that will be hard. It's economic, political, social, cultural, and wide ranging. And what that will look like, I don't know. I will be part of that just as a participant. I'm not going to decide what that will be. That will be a collective effort. But we do have to at least understand what happened before we can get to that conversation. So it's good to do the land acknowledgement and go into other steps too.
There, and then one here, so I'll do both of those. Fun.
Your comment, I think, is connected to why people don't want to do critical race theory, because the whole question of reparation. Do you want to speak about that a little bit more?
Sure. I mean, I have to say, as I explained in my introduction, I went to college and learned from people that we call the new labor and social historians, and I thought I had a pretty good understanding of like the history of America from the bottom up, which is sort of the approach that they took, including that I knew at least something about, you know, how Native Americans were wronged by white settler colonists and the U.S. government. I feel like a different person now after having written this book in terms of my understanding of Native American history, just with the very little bit that I did to do the first chapter. And I would imagine that, you know, if I had to do that, that other white people, especially, that it's going to take some work, that there's a lot to be done. And I feel like, you know, it was transformative. But I was open to it, right? And so how hard is it going to be for people that aren't open to it? And then also thinking about what are the implications of that? And I think, yeah, that's why people are fighting so hard on this critical race theory. I mean, basically books like mine, I mean, it's not banned anywhere, but like it is, if you read the No Left Turn on Education website, they talk about why they organized, and the immediate event that prompted them to organize was George Floyd's murder. Well, they don't say that, but they say when George Floyd died, I think, then the woman who founded it, her kids had to do some like other kind of curriculum around cultural sensitivity or something like that. And she was outraged, right? And so she pulled her kids out of school to keep them away from that. And then she talks about how, and then they had to learn things like that, white people were stealing land and exploiting people and whatever. And I just didn't want them to hear that. And I'm thinking, well, that's exactly what my book talks about. And I mean, that's what they don't want people to read these things. They don't have to actually, entertain the possibility that that might be the history of America, right? So how do you do that? If you can't make a counter argument, then you just have to remove it from the conversation, right? And that's the only way that they can stop the conversation from taking place. But it's not going to happen. They're not going to be successful. It's going to be a battle, but they're not going to be successful. You can't not. This like history like this can't be suppressed, right? People, and as you saw, and some of you maybe have been involved. One of the things that surprised me as the protests intensified when George Floyd was killed was how many white people were involved in that. I mean, I was not surprised the Black activists were involved. I was surprised to see so many white people, though, doing what they were doing, and to great risk. Some of them getting arrested, some of them getting beaten, shot at, and they kept doing it. And not only in Minnesota, but in other parts of the country. And I don't know why. I think we still need some time to figure that out, like historians, to sort of explain where those white people came from. But they came out, and they did involve themselves. And so there are people out there that want to know this history, I think.
So I really appreciate your focus on the active side of racial exclusion, not just that it's a passive thing. And I'm intrigued by the connection between the highway expansion, the interstates coming through, and just wiping out very vivid, vibrant African-American neighborhoods. In the cities, in the longer term, and I'm from the Northeast in a similar way, so I've seen lots of cities where in the 70s and the 80s, we talked about blight. We talked to the urban development, the urban renewal was coming through in big projects, even earlier than that. And the cities were described as being hollowed out, and that the cores had really decayed, the transportation systems weren't working, the housing stock had declined. How much do you think that is neglect that was purposeful? How much was it choice of government leaders and people, functionaries in the inside of government, like engineers, choosing to abandon those areas and then put priority on the outer rings and the new developments?
Well, this might just stick with me for a second. I know you're going to be okay with this, but some other people in the audience are going to feel a little bit of a jolt as I'm going to say something that's a little unpopular, which is that I think some of the people that are involved in city planning and urban renewal in the 1930s and 40s had good intentions. I think that they thought what the work they were doing was going to lead to improved communities. That their vision wasn't to remove a bunch of people and just fill it in with a bunch of new residents. That there was an effort on the part of some liberal and even radical urban planning folks and engineers to just fix some problems in communities. And Rondo, or the Rondo area, the area west of the Capitol in St. Paul, is not hollowed out. It is a pretty vibrant community, but there are things that needed to be addressed. And it is the place where there's the largest Black population in the Twin Cities, but it is also, remember, the most integrated part of the Twin Cities. There are Black and white people living together, and sometimes they're in the same family. Getting back to this point about interracial marriage, there are a lot of interracial couples and families in the Rondo area. When the planners started getting involved in trying to address problems in the community. Before '94, before the highway expansion, there's an urban renewal project, and it displaces, along with the highway then too, it displaces both Black and white residents. So it wasn't just African Americans that were removed. What happened, however, is because African Americans face discrimination in the housing market, they can't go very far. And white people, you can look at maps in the St. Paul Regional, the St. Paul Redevelopment and Housing Authority actually has very good records. And they tracked where people went, and they found white people are going in, outside of Rondo, and some of them going even to Minneapolis, some of them going to the suburbs, and African Americans are getting concentrated in a smaller and smaller area around the Selby-Dale intersection. And the same thing is probably true with the area that 35W destroyed too. White people, not as many there, is probably more African Americans, a greater percentage of the population there was African Americans, but Black and white were being displaced by that highway construction, but white people have a different experience in terms of going somewhere else, right? So, and this gets back to the point I was making about policy. Yes, the state was involved, or the city and state and federal government were involved in removing African Americans, but it wasn't really, the policy isn't the only part of the thing that explains it's not the only thing that explains what happened to Black residents. It's also white prejudice that kept Black people from moving somewhere like white people. And this is happening also, by the mid 60s, this is happening when Minnesota has a fair housing law. So there's a state agency that is supposed to enforce the law, and Black residents make complaints about the housing discrimination they're facing when they try to rent apartments or buy a house. And the state agency follows up with that. And so I know cases, I can tell you names of people that are facing discrimination, and they don't really ever resolve those cases. The African Americans just have to, they don't ever really rule or manage to get the white people to stand down, and the African Americans just simply continue to navigate a racist housing market. So even with a law that still doesn't really protect Blacks from discrimination. So that's an example of how complicated the story is. And so what would reparations look like there? It's not just that the state did wrong or the city did wrong, but also what about all the white residents who were renting houses, selling their house? What about all the realtors, real estate companies? What about all the banks that denied mortgages? What about the police who kept trying to enforce a perimeter around the Rondo area and say, if I find you outside of Lexington Parkway, then I'm, gonna arrest you. Like, that's also part of racial exclusion, right? Does that answer your question, or start to answer? Okay.
Do you have any other questions here in Ostrander?
You all are dedicated, though. I thought for sure. I mean, this is a good conversation, and thank you so much for coming and being involved and attentive in this. This is really good.
So I know you touched a little bit on education, and so I was just really curious with, also you were saying about how there is people out there who want to learn. So I was just curious if you have ever gone to like high schools or considered that, or when you think that you'll start to see that shift, because even though you're talking about like critical race theory, you presented like a lot of facts today. So, and that's not an experience that at least I got growing up. So when do you think you'll start to see that shift in education for like younger children?
That's a good question. I suppose it depends on the teachers. I have not spoken in a high school yet. I would certainly do it if I had an invitation. And I think that would be a really great way to try to sort of translate the book, right, to an audience. I mean, I remember when I was in high school, I really hated history because my teachers were terrible and it was so boring. Like we read a textbook and then they said, okay, now answer the 3 questions at the end of the chapter. And I was like, wow, why would you do this? Like, this is terrible. And I remember even getting in trouble on purpose. So I'd have to go to the office and get out of history class. But, I got to college and I learned that that's not really what historians do, that we look at primary sources and we try to create an argument about the past or an interpretation of the past. And I find that very exciting. And so I would love to engage white high school students with that. But I also think high school students could be doing projects around, local history. They could be doing things like the Mapping Prejudice or Racial Covenant work. And certainly that I'm sure people would welcome high school students into that effort. I actually don't know how to do that research myself, and I would like to get trained in doing it. But what's the other part of your question? The second part of your question? Yeah. Right. 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 Well, if my sister has anything to do with it, you'll never get to learn any of that. So. We have to fight for it. Black studies programs, African American history, all of that is in our curriculum because people fought for it. And that doesn't mean that it isn't valid just because people don't want it in the curriculum. And school officials who supposedly know better about what should be in the curriculum are telling you it shouldn't be there. It just means that it's politics, right? And that there's actually, as we've talked about, then there's a reason why they don't want it there. Some people, it's about reframing the world, and so to some extent, it's up to high school students, college students, myself, teachers, faculty, other people to do the work of fighting to get this included. And it won't be easy, and it'll be easier in some places than others. It's going to be easier in Massachusetts than Texas, but it's still a battle. It's still going to be something. And even my colleagues, I mean, we just had a department meeting last week, and we've been trying to hire somebody to replace the person who did Asian history for us for 2 years, and we can't get the dean to approve that hire. Meanwhile, we have one person of color in our department of 14 faculty, and we don't have anybody that teaches Asian history, let alone the history of East Asia in Lowell, which has the second largest Cambodian population in the country, right? That's on us. That's on us in our department to fight for that faculty line and to get that. That's in college, right? To get that included as a part of our curriculum. So, but there's a lot of reasons why the dean says we can't have that job, right? But I don't have an easy answer for you. But I do think the Black Lives Matter protests probably help advance this. I mean, I think that that was about George Floyd's murder, but the activism has a wide-ranging effect and impact, including probably what happens in schools. And so that's also why people are afraid of it, right? That's why critical race theory is a response essentially to the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think, besides the debate we're having about policing and so-called defunding of the police departments, we're arguing about schools partly because people are out in the streets protesting, right?